Well, here we are in our last week in the Psalms. One more week in the Psalms, just today. We've been going through the Psalms for quite a while, and we're going to conclude that today together with Psalm 72. Now, this morning will be a little different in focus, of course, as we talk about social justice. But when you look through the Psalms, there's a number of Psalms that talk about justice. And ours text for today is no different. It talks about justice. Psalm 72. So I'll spend one more day in the Psalms. We've talked about glorifying God, and you just saw it up on the screen. For His word, His character, His promises, His Messiah, for His ways. We talked about for His power, and for His promises. We talked about for His faithfulness. All these different ways we glorify God. And this morning, we even sort of continue that theme. We glorify God for His justice. We thank God for His justice. Now, it's a little more awkward, I'll admit that this morning. It's a heavy topic, it's a serious topic, and so it's hard to maybe link it to glorifying God, thanking God. And yet, God is God, and so we glorify Him. He deserves our praise, and He deserves our honor and respect, and we thank Him for His justice. And I think that it's possible for us to talk about something, to celebrate something, to be grateful for something while being solemn and reflective and serious about something else. We'll try to do that this morning as we prepare our hearts for a time of prayer. But we do glorify God for His justice as we reflect on the injustice in our world today and what our place is as the church. I heard a story some time ago, I don't know if it's true or not, but it's about a judge who was speaking to a defendant about a case he was about to have. He was going to be tried for burglary, and so the judge said, now it's up to you, you can either be tried by me or you can be tried by your peers. And the guy said, well, what are peers? He said, those are like-minded people. They're people just like you. You're equals, people that are just the same as you. And so he thought for a second, he said, no, I don't want to be tried by people that I can't trust. I don't think there was much need for a trial after that. Sometimes, though, trials aren't so clear-cut. Sometimes the guilty go free, and sometimes the innocent are convicted. Our justice system is not perfect. It's because the penal system is created by people, and people aren't perfect. And so sometimes we get it wrong. The OT law, the Old Testament law, can be sort of compared to our justice system in a way, but they're not exactly the same. And even with the small similarities between the Old Testament law and our current system of laws in the world today, when it comes to the word justice, there are even more differences between sort of what we read about in the Old Testament and what the world talks about today as justice. Most often the term in the Bible translates best to what we might call social justice. It translates to judgment as well, but most often, especially when the prophets are speaking, the best translation for us is social justice. They're advocating for, they're speaking for. Now in the dictionary, if you look at the term justice, I looked through a number of different examples of this, but it says it's the quality of being fair and reasonable. The quality of being fair and reasonable, being just. And then justice, the administration of the law or the authority that maintains this, that fairness and reason. And that definition, ironically, is fair and reasonable. But it's also not a full representation of what God talks about when He talks about justice. When He speaks through His prophets Amos, who calls for justice to flow like a stream. The main synonym for justice in the dictionary is the word fairness. And that's important. That is somewhat in line with what God is saying through the prophets. But there's still more to it than that. Fairness is something that children understand. We're told about it all the time. That's their main complaint. That's not fair, right? Justice, I think, is something you learn as you grow. You come to an understanding more and more of what justice is. What is just. It's more than just fairness. And our world needs more than fairness, and God calls us to more than fairness when He comes to His justice. He calls us to be people of grace and compassion and understanding and charity and peace and wisdom and righteousness. That's what we're called to. One definition I found for having a sense of justice is a little more maybe in line with what we'll talk about this morning. It says having a concern or for peace and a genuine respect for people. I'd combine those two things and say having a genuine concern for people. That is a sense of justice that lines up fairly well with what God spoke through the prophets when they spoke about justice. Now, at the same time, it's only fair that I mentioned that the Hebrew word used here and used most often perhaps mishpat, and I'm not sure, I think that's how you pronounce it. It does sometimes refer to judgment and law and has connection sort of with our penal system. It absolutely does at times, but that's at times. And we have to look at the context around when it's used to know exactly what the person using the term means. And here in our text, it's used in a very specific way. We look at the context of the word, and almost always, or at least quite often, when we see this word in the Old Testament, it's always connected somehow to defending the poor or the oppressed and pleading their case. Very often. And the same is true in our text this morning. It's almost always also connected to another word. If you went and did a word search in the Bible for this word, or even for justice, depending on the translation of the Bible you're using, there aren't too many occurrences where this word isn't attached to another word. And that word is righteousness. Righteousness. Justice and righteousness. Now it's interesting, in our text, in Psalm 72, the word righteousness, when it's there, one of the translations of what the Hebrew word is justice. But we know it's not justice that the writer is talking about, because he wouldn't say justice and justice, right? And the context gives us some guidance on what he's trying to tell us. Because this word, tzedek, righteousness, can mean a number of things. It can mean honesty or goodness or innocence or virtue, or, this one is interesting, communal loyalty, who are our own. It means doing what is right, being right, and doing right. And then justice tries to tell us what is right. And so you have this understanding, these two things together, this knowing and this doing in justice and righteousness. It isn't enough to just know what's right. It's not enough to be mindful of what is good or right. We have to do. We have to act. There's an old saying that says, bad things happen when good people do nothing. Well, Jesus said that in this world you'll have trouble. So I think there's always going to be bad things. But I also think that if good people do nothing, then the bad is allowed to prosper and endure, it's allowed to grow and fester. And so we're called to respond. We're called to action, we're called to justice, we're called to righteousness as His church, as His people. Our psalm this morning is an interesting one. It's a prayer for the anointed king, and most people believe, based on how it's written and the title that it's given, that it's written by David to Solomon. We're not 100% sure of that, but that's not the point. It's written for the king, the anointed king. And it's full of hope. Yes, it's full of hope that his territory, of course it is, that his territory would grow, that he would be successful. Absolutely. That's a big part of what the psalm is about. That's what they were praying for their king. But just as much as that, it's a prayer that the king would administer justice and that he would fight for the oppressed, would end all forms of oppression. And it was a very common theme in the Old Testament when it came to the kings. It was a common cultural thing in ancient Israel. The kings were often the judges and the protectors, the ones who would watch over the fairness, I guess, of their kingdom, if you want to use that term. That was their role. And one of their most important parts of that role was to invoke justice where it was needed. And in accordance with what God called them to do, so often it was what we would consider social justice, as they fought for the oppressed and worked among the oppressed. God sent prophets to the kings to keep them in track, to keep them accountable, so they lived justly and righteously. I think of Nathan to David, if you know the story, when David failed major, total injustice. And Nathan says, "Thou art the man. You're the guilty party here, King David." And God sent the prophets to the kings to try and keep them on track with what they were called to do. And it didn't always work because the kings didn't always listen. But it's a clear picture of God caring so much about justice and righteousness for His people. Psalm 72 is a great picture of what God wanted and what the people needed out of their kings. Kings of Israel, Judah. The king's calling is confirmed in this prayer, the prayer of his people for their anointed king. That he would live out his reign, that he would have a large reign and a blessed and a widespread reign. Interesting, I'm skipping from my notes because I cut this part out to try and... I cut stuff out of my sermons every week, believe it or not. You're thinking, those are shortened sermons? Wow! No way. But I do. I cut this part out because we're praying afterwards. But I'm going to say it anyways. It's interesting, in verse 7, the word in the NIV, because Steve read from the NIV, and the Pew Bible's NIV, it says prosperity. I think it's verse 7. It's not in my notes anymore. But it says prosperity. Now, the Hebrew word is shalom. And most of us probably know what that word is. We've heard it before. Shalom doesn't necessarily mean prosperity when we read it most often. It means peace. Peace. Now, it can mean prosperity because it can also mean success and your wanted end result, right? What I want to come to. It means security and safety and good health, a place of health. This word shalom is very full. But I think the best, and I think the NRSV uses the word peace. May peace reign in your rule, King. That's the prayer. May peace reign. There's other words. Prosperity is mentioned elsewhere. They want them to be prosperous, of course, but they pray for peace at the hand of the king. That justice and righteousness of God would be revealed and shown in his reign. But how would he do so? Well, Psalm 72 gives us quite a list. He invokes God's justice and he lives as righteous in these are some of the ways. By defending the afflicted, by saving the children who are helpless, by judging the oppressor, by delivering the needy who cry out, that's in verse 12, by helping those who need help and have no one to help them. They're helpless. And by rescuing the oppressed. These are the ways in Psalm 72 that the king is being called into righteousness and justice, the righteousness and justice of God. This is the justice that God talks about so often through the prophets, like Amos, over and over again, and Micah. And there's many more. Ezekiel. And Ezekiel didn't hold back about it either. But what happens towards the end of the Old Testament, I talked about the king and his responsibility. It was a great responsibility. The oppressed of the kingdom were his responsibility. Wow. Wow. But what happens by the end of the Old Testament? There aren't kings anymore. Israel doesn't have a king anymore. Judah doesn't have a king anymore. And the prophets that God once sent to the king, to keep the king in line, who would keep the people in line, hopefully, came to the people. And they spoke to the people. And they had a similar story to tell, and a similar calling to make. Eventually the prophets that God sends come to speak to us, to all the people. And it becomes obvious in what they share that this job description has been filtered down from the king to his people. Now, I'm talking about what it meant at the time, of course. This text, very obviously, in light of Christ, is prophetic, in my mind. But to the people in that day who heard it first, before Jesus showed up, this is a powerful word. And it continued through the other prophets to the people. This is our calling. We have a calling like Isaiah 1:17. This is the Message translation of it. Say no to wrong, learn to do good, work for justice, help the down and out, stand up for the homeless, go to bat for the defenseless. I like the Message. Defend the cause of the oppressed, do good, seek justice. This is Isaiah's word. And so many other of the prophets God sent. To us, it's the calling of the church. The oppressed are our business. If we strive to be people after God's own righteousness, then we strive after the justice for the oppressed. They go together, they always have. Righteousness and justice. It's not easy, and sometimes the hardest part is knowing what to do and how to do anything, because we know what's wrong and we know that something needs to be done, but we don't know what in the world we can possibly do. I'm very grateful for what we're doing here locally. Very proud, and I shouldn't be proud, that's a bad word to use, but I am proud of what we do locally. But there's so much hurt in the world. We need to make sure we're doing something, always. I'm not sure how many of you, we've got a picture here, remember this strapping young lad? This is Andrew Benson. He's a cadet. He was here with us at Christmas time. And I know the Kleins know him well. Took him in for a couple of weeks. Andrew is in his second year now. He started something called the Joyful Project not too long before he went to training college. Now, normally when you go to training college, you leave your nets. Right? That's what we all had to do. You're going, you're called, you leave your nets. But I think in a lot of wisdom, CFOT, the training college, let Andrew keep this project of his, which you can consider a small business, really. Because he buys and he sells product, if you want to consider it buying the product. But certainly he sells product with the Joyful Project. Now they do more than just sell product. They have fundraisers and they do concerts at different places. When he came here, I had to drive to Peterborough to get him at like 10 o'clock in the night and drove him back. He showed up at the Kleins like all hours of the night. But it was worth the drive because he was having a concert to raise money for a local shelter in Peterborough. That was to start off his winter assignment. So that was through the Joyful Project. But they have this other piece where they sell product. And that's where these t-shirts come in. The regular work is selling stuff like this. T-shirts like this, like the one he's wearing in the picture, Colonel Gwen had on earlier, and that I'm wearing now. Let me tell you about my t-shirt. He makes the designs and his team makes the design, but they're from a group called Free Set. I spent $25 on this t-shirt. That's the most money I've ever spent on a t-shirt ever in my entire life. Even if I really like the graphic. If I like the graphic enough that it's like a $15 or $16 or maybe $19 t-shirt, I'll ask Kathleen to get it for me for Christmas or something. I don't like spending money on t-shirts, but I didn't spend that money on this t-shirt. I spent it on hope. Because this t-shirt, well, it's 100% cotton, organic cotton. That might matter to some of you. It is healthy for the environment and healthy for us, I guess. But more than that, the cotton was farmed from a fair trade cotton farm, because cotton is one of the resources in the world, like coffee and chocolate, that people are paid very poor wages to farm. in parts of the world, less than $1 a day, most of them. And so they were paid fair wages to farm this cotton, and then the cotton was used by the ladies from Sept to knit or sew, or I don't know how you make a t-shirt. But whatever they did, they used that cotton to make this t-shirt. And those ladies at Sept, they have quite the stories. They're ladies who were saved from the sex trade in India. This shirt was made in Calcutta by a woman who at some point stood in a line. And now she has a job. She's been trained to do it. And she has income for her family. And that's what I paid for. On Sept's website, and you can get there through the Joyful Project's website, that's what Andrew's doing really. He's trying to get this stuff sort of known and sold in Canada, right? But there's a number of different stories from some of these women on their website, and I want to share one in closing with you. Just a few parts from one of the stories. I think there's a slide. Slide, that's how old I am. Shirty's story. Now, these are all changed names, but this is the story attached to this lady. It's a true story. She says this: I can't tell you how old I am, because I don't know. Before I started work at Sept, life was very hard. Day after day, I stood in a line. And I hope I don't have to tell you what that line was. On the days when customers didn't come in, I didn't eat. My life was so hard. When my father and mother died, I had to pay for their funerals. My grandmother died, I paid for her funeral. And that was how I paid. It was up to me to provide for my brother. Whatever I had in the bank was all gone to pay for family. I used to pray to God to help me leave the line. And now He has. And He's shown me the right road. God gave me this job at Sept. And now I'm healthy. Friends, she goes on, I didn't write this down, but she goes on to talk about how more of her family, she's nervous for her family because this is such a common thing in Calcutta and some parts of the world. And she's managed to find jobs for her family, for her granddaughter now. How life has changed, and she attributes that to God, She's grateful to God. Friends, there are things that we can do locally, and I'm so proud of those things. But we all need to be doing something. Even if it's just buying a shirt. I know that some people can't physically do certain things. I know that some people can't afford to buy t-shirts even that are $25. I understand that. But we all can do something. We're all going to pray. I know that. We're going to pray this morning for those people that are victims and for those people that are fighting. But God, help us to act justly and to love mercy like Micah called us to do so long ago that we talked about at the start of our service. Help us, Lord, to love mercy and to act justly and to walk humbly with our God. We're the Salvation Army, friends. The Salvation Army. An army ought to be proactive and on the move. And we're not always there. We need to be actively fighting for people's salvation. That is salvation from sin and salvation from oppression. Both. That's always been what we were about. God, help us to do it. As we pray this morning for those people, help us to keep these convictions in mind. God, help us to be brave enough to pray the prayer, Lord, give me opportunities. And give me the courage to take them. Whatever that might look like in your life. We're going to pray together this morning, spend some time in prayer, sing a few courses, and I'm going to leave it open for people to pray. We're going to pray and sing with hope. The chorus together, God will make a way when there seems to be no way. He works in ways we cannot see. I can imagine some of the ladies in India, they were hopeless, right? And all of a sudden this person comes along and say, I have a job that you can do if you're willing to make that change. And all of a sudden there's a way made when there seemed to be no way. Thank God for His justice, and thank God for His people that are involved in people's lives in Calcutta, in Aurelia, wherever we find ourselves. God, use us, and God, help us to be used. We're going to sing this chorus a couple times through, and after we do, I'm going to invite the congregation. Maybe if there's someone here who feels led to pray, I'm going to leave it open for someone to pray for those victims who think there's no way, who don't know there's people praying for them, who don't know there are resources and there are people that care. If someone would pray for those victims in the midst of human trafficking. People shouldn't be bought and sold. It shouldn't exist in our world today, but it does. So we're going to pray. I know this is heavy stuff. We only do it once a year. I hope you pray for it more often than that. We're going to pray after we sing, God will make a way.